This is the Good Morning Isla200 Show.
This podcast was prepared by the Fall 2023 cohort of Isla200 Islamic Civilizations at McGill University.
Grab a warm drink and tune in as our presenters take you on a deep dive into Islamicate history with reflections on how they relate to contemporary Muslim life and culture.
Hey everyone, I'm Suri and I'm coming to you today from McGill University, and I'm here with my group members who are going to introduce themselves now.
Hi, I'm Mashaal.
I'm Stella.
Hi, I'm Anne-Marie.
I'm Noala.
Okay, and today we are going to try in our podcast episode to answer the question of how is Sharia interpreted and translated into modern diasporic Muslim women's experiences in the Western secular world. And particularly, we're going to be doing that through looking at the movie Hala. Now, Anne-Marie is going to tell you a bit about that movie.
Hala is a movie written and directed by Minhal Baig, who's a Pakistani-American Muslim filmmaker. It was made in 2019, and it's based off of a short film made by Minhal Baig in 2016. It's fictional, but it's loosely inspired by her personal experiences, and it was filmed in Chicago, where she grew up. Hala is a coming-of-age story centering on a 17-year-old Pakistani-American Muslim girl named Hala, as she manages her relationship with her parents, her hopes for the future, and the role of religion in her life.
This film was a rare case of a mainstream film in the West being directed by a brown Muslim woman, so its own voices representation, but it also follows in tropes about Islam in Western media, being limiting, and many reviews of the film use things like culture clash to describe how Islam is presented in the film.
Okay, cool. Let's talk about some of the major themes of the movie. What do we think about what do the words Islam and Muslim mean to us, and what do we think when we see a Muslim woman? Because in the movie that's quite a big theme.
I think just to start, the way the audience will interpret and understand the movie, well, their preconceived notions before watching the movie of what Islam is and what a Muslim woman is would guide a lot about how they would understand the movie as well. Because in the movie, as we saw, a lot of things were left to interpretation, and there were also a lot of plot twists as well that we did not see coming. Because there are a lot of things that are left unsaid, and the director doesn't really want to spoon feed her audience either. Rather, she leaves many things open to interpretation. And also, Hala is quite a quiet girl, let's just be honest. So rather we see how she feels and navigates all this through poetry. All to say is that how the audience initially understood what Muslim is and what Islam is before watching it really dictates the viewing and the message they take out of the film. And what we saw is that it could really vary between the audience.
Yeah, I like what you said about interpretation. It made me think about the ending, which was kind of what I came into the film thinking about, knowing particularly that Hala chooses to take off her hijab and enter the world when she moves to university at the end of the film. So the film's ending is also up to the interpretation of the audience, although in previous discussion we talked about how we think the director is leading the audience to see that she's renouncing her religion in a very significant way by the end of the film. But we can consider what is Hala's religious and cultural identity at the end of the film through her actions. So do we consider Hala a Muslim woman a woman at the end of the film, a Muslim who has betrayed her faith in some way over the course of the film? Or perhaps her identity has undergone some kind of evolution, and that now she more identifies with a cultural identity but does not see a purpose for religion in her life. All of these things kind of lend to how we consider Muslim identity and Islam.
When I watched the film, the ending to me was she's leaving her religion, letting go of her religion, and that she prays for the last time, maybe has a revelation during that or prior to that. Yeah, and then when she takes off her hijab and walks out, that's kind of her letting go of her religion. But I do completely, I see the other perspective. I think it's very interesting to have this. Again, it leaves a lot of room for interpretation, and yeah.
Okay, cool. So we think this movie is challenging the expectations that people have of Muslim women and girls, while also kind of playing into some Western stereotypes. Now I want to talk a bit about Sharia and Sharia law, how it's perceived by Westerners and Western non-Muslims, and how it's kind of, we think it's this rigid and flexible thing, and like I want to hear your thoughts about that.
Like, the reason why we decided to talk about Sharia this episode is because a lot of modern discourse about the like caged Muslim woman stereotype that we mentioned is related to Sharia, and Sharia law is generally seen as like the site of like a woman's lack of agency and rights in Islam, whether it should or shouldn't be. So yeah, who wants to start by talking about some things that we learned about Sharia?
Right, absolutely. So, like, the idea of what Sharia is very vague around the world, I'd say, as well. Because, like, there isn't, like, as we learned in class, there isn't really any country right now that even follows Sharia law to begin with, even if they do proclaim to be doing so. As we saw from our book that we read by Hala. So just for our audience, let's just repeat, like, what is Sharia? Sharia is basically this broad set of principles that govern the life of Muslims and every aspect of it, be it the religious or the secular aspect as well. It's acting as a moral compass and a guide for us to, like, what are the rights that other people have upon me? Like, what rights do my neighbors have upon me that I must, like, make sure I fulfill and stuff? And how do I deal with business transactions or inheritance as well? And all of this is in essence to protect 5 fundamental things, which is the honor and respect to all human beings, the family unit, the deen or Islam, and a few others. So yeah, and what we learned, what was very interesting about Sharia is that, like, Sharia is not this rigid, uniform, unchanging thing, but rather, since Sharia, it was basically developed after the Prophet passed away by Muslims who wanted to know how to deal with nuances as to what they experienced in their life by deriving knowledge from, like, what happened in the Quran and Sunnah to understand and interpret, all right, how does that apply to me now in this day and age in my circumstance? And thus, because of that, we know about how it evolves and changes. But the fact that it's dynamic and flexible, rather, that's very crucial. So yeah, and then many people don't really know about this, and not only non-Muslims, but even Muslims themselves.
There are a lot of myths about Sharia, especially in the Western world. One misconception is that women cannot divorce their husbands in Islam. It's easy for a man to divorce their wife. They basically can do it on any grounds for whatever reason, and there's no question. And a woman, if she wishes to divorce her husband, she can give up her dowry or financial means for divorce, or if she has a reason like domestic violence or her husband is not providing for her or some other marital issue, she can go to a court and be granted a divorce. So women can divorce their husbands. It is harder, but there are built-in systems to protect women. And this connects to our movie Hala, because her mother, Aram, chooses to divorce her husband, and she does so by saying talaq 3 times, which is traditionally a way that a husband divorces their wife.
Well, we were talking about how traditionally that's how a husband would, like, initiate divorce, but in, like, the current day, anyone would say that to initiate divorce. It's part of, like, a cultural...
Yeah, it's like a cultural thing. It's like, oh, I'm so done with you, I'm just gonna leave you. And then you're like, talaq. Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that it happens like that. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like the woman says talaq, talaq, and then, oh, it's over. Like, no, there is a process to go through, and it, from my understanding, the points that the wife in the situation makes are to be, you know, like, the reasons that she gives for divorce have to be looked at and have to be analyzed. Like Anne-Marie said, the husband could divorce without any sort of grounds necessarily, but the wife cannot. And so it has to be investigated, the reasons behind why she... So it's not just like culturally speaking, it's not necessarily like talaq, and it's over. No, there's like a process.
Yeah, but what I think is important is because we're considering, like, Muslim diaspora in the West, and, like, Hala is like a 2nd generation American. I just think that the instance of the mother saying talaq, talaq, talaq is a good example of how the history of Sharia is, like, filtered throughout time into modern casual practices of Muslims, like, every day.
What's also interesting to note is that while Sharia is very flexible and dynamic, there are certain principles that are set in stone and don't change. And those are the things that's explicitly stated in the Quran. So there are only a few laws that are explicitly stated in the Quran, and those are about inheritance and family matters like divorce or like who you can marry and stuff like that. So divorce is also very explicitly mentioned as to like how you can do that. I think that's just a point to note that though it's dynamic and changing, that one principle doesn't change in a sense.
I think Sharia in its roots was definitely dynamic, but it's not necessarily regarded as dynamic as it once was.
In the new Islamic, yes.
In the new Islamic. So I think it's important to note that as well. So it's not like anyone can make up their own Sharia. They still have to refer to a mufti or some Islamic imam or figure.
Or you can just read it up yourself and be like,
Sure, but I think there would be a lot of people who would come up to you and say, based off personal, other Muslims or other people who are regarded as higher in knowledge of Islam or Sharia law or whatever you may regard it, would tell you that you're wrong. So yes, in like 7th century BC,
BC,
comment CE, after Christ, guys. Perhaps there was, a time when Sharia was much more fluid, but it's, I think, personally, unfortunately, not as fluid as it once was. But with this, when we're looking at a situation like Hala's, like this film, because it's a diaspora community and there's no choice but for them to be fluid with their culture. She herself, by the end of the film, she prays, but then she takes off her hijab. That's not necessarily the most rigid understanding of Islamic law. So yes, and they have no choice but to be dynamic with how they practice their religion because they're a diaspora community, not in a necessarily Islamic society. So in certain situations, it has to be dynamic, but it's not necessarily, Islamic wise, specifically, like if we're looking at the Middle East or other Islamic nations, it's not seen as dynamic as one may call it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Just to end this kind of discussion around Sharia and divorce, I want to just ask the table, do Muslim women have to reject Islam in a way to have autonomy? Because I think a big misconception with Sharia is that Muslim women don't have autonomy. What do you guys think?
That's a good question.
I personally, in the group, did a lot of The Veil and the Male Elite by Mernisi. And there was a lot about what it means to be a woman in Islam. And there was this sort of distinction that Mernisi makes in her book, that the Islam of the companions of, specifically the male companions of Prophet Muhammad, their version of Islam, it can be potentially different, perhaps vastly different from the version of Islam that the Prophet himself and the women around him perceived Islam to be. Throughout Islamic history, there is examples of Omar, who was known as a major companion. This is in Mernisi's book. He was unfortunately known for being abusive to women. And he was abusing his wife, one of his wives, and she responds with, she talks back, and Omar goes, "Why are you talking back? You're my wife. You have no right to talk back." And she says, "Well, the wives of the Prophet talk back to him." And apparently he goes to Prophet Muhammad and goes to their wives, and he's like, "You are the Prophet's wives. Why do you talk back to him? And why you should not talk back to him?" And one of the wives, she says, this idea that women could not be outspoken with regards to misogyny in Islam is not necessarily true. Because earlier in Islam, in its very early history, the wives of the Prophet himself, like Aisha and many of his other wives, were outspoken in speaking against certain hadiths that did not seem just or did not seem correct, actually, or legitimate. Or if, like there's this story where Prophet Muhammad tells Aisha to consult her parents on a certain issue, and Aisha responds with saying, "Well, I'm a grown woman, don't tell me what to do." So there's certain instances where a woman has established her autonomy throughout Islamic history, but today in the Islamic and in what's perceived as Sharia and what's for many Islamic nations has been coded, like it's written down as Sharia law, in quote unquote Sharia law, is that women do not necessarily have the autonomy to make decisions for themselves. There should always be male validation in some regard. And so Hala, I feel, has to deal with that version of Islam that she was born into, and that version of Islam that her family accepted, where she couldn't necessarily be autonomous with her decisions, and she always had to avoid her father. So,
okay, awesome. Let's talk briefly about Sunnah and Hadith.
I think this ties in well with like different versions of Islam, right? Because like if people have different versions of Islam, well then I think you're gonna have to back it up, right, with some sources, be it the Quran or Hadith, which are the primary sources. And there aren't multiple Qurans, there's just one Quran. And with hadiths, they've been thoroughly verified using the isnad and such. So, this reminds me of what we learned in class today about how the idea of what being a Muslim is not monolithic, nor is there just one type of Muslim. But the fact that there isn't one type of Muslim, does that mean that there are multiple different Islams? People look to the past to see the companions, how they dealt with all of this, the female and the male companions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now moving on to some more specific examples from the Sunnah and the Hadith.
So an example in Hadith is Ibn Umar divorces his wife when she's on her period, which is forbidden, and Muhammad condemns him for this. And he also uses this point to emphasize that you can't divorce your wife during her period and then go back to her and specifically have sex with her when she's off of her period.
So in a sense, be like, when this suits me, I'm just gonna be with you, but when it doesn't, I'm just gonna dip.
Yeah, so this is just another protection for women within marriage from the Hadith.
Yeah, and another example of a protection for women in marriage is presented in a venture of Islam. And this argument states that marriage in Islam was created to give more agency and a stronger position to women and daughters over marriage that was happening in Arab society at the time. So, for example, the mahar was given to the woman instead of her family.
I have sort of trouble. I don't necessarily have any scholarly sources to support this, so this is all coming out of my head, so disclaimer. But I don't necessarily think that we should fully argue and accept the idea that in Islam, marriage for a woman is about giving her agency, because I don't necessarily think it is. A lot of times throughout Islamic history, some of the Prophet's wives themselves, Aisha, for example, they were younger, much younger, when they were arranged to marriage, and so they didn't necessarily have a say in the marriage. Their families had a say in the marriage. So right off the bat, the woman in that situation, or the girl in that situation, has no agency in choosing who she's going to live with. Mm-hmm. And second, when she's in that marriage, there has to be some dire circumstance for her to then propose a divorce. So I kind of have trouble just accepting the idea that marriage, the whole point of marriage is to give the wife full agency because she's going to get a bridesmaid or a mahar. I don't necessarily see that as full agency, because first of all, she didn't necessarily have a choice in marrying in the first place. Yeah. And secondly, she can't just divorce because she doesn't like the husband, because she has to have some terrible reason to divorce him.
Yeah. I definitely hear what you're saying. I guess I also don't have exact sources to say it, but the way that I kind of saw this argument was that it would, marriage in Islam is considering in a misogynistic society, working within that to, pioneer, or if women are disadvantaged and entering unions in which they do not have full ability to consent or make choices, when they're entering these unions, there's a structure involved that would allow them rights. I don't know. I feel like it's working within a misogynistic system, and maybe that was my interpretation of the argument.
Cool. Also, to your point about Aisha and many of the other wives being younger than the Prophet married 7 wives. The first wife that he married was actually 15 years older than him, and plus she had already been married before, and she was just an independent woman who actually proposed to the Prophet. And that's how they got married. Then the second thing is actually all the other wives of the Prophet had been married before. Only Aisha was the only one who was younger than him and the only one who was a virgin. When the woman gives consent, which the woman is actually asked 3 times, you actually consent to this, rather from the man. But even though the way it's
with all due respect, do we think that 9-year-old Aisha had any understanding of what marriage or marriage life is?
While the marriage was but this is just another different argument, right? This 9-year-old girl. Well, first of all, in that society, girls were considered women after they got their periods.
I'm just saying that today, I think in Islamic and throughout history, men have used this argument.
Oh, absolutely.
And then they've married, 11, 12-year-olds, which is disgusting to me. So that's why
You're saying that men are still using this argument today?
Throughout Islamic, in certain communities in Islamic.
Just wanted to highlight that's what you're trying to say.
I'm from Iran, in the Iranian law, because it follows quote-unquote Sharia law, their version of Sharia law at least, marital rape does not exist. And so, that's why it gets dangerous to say, throughout Islamic, and Islam just brought so much power to agency to women in marriage. I don't necessarily see that.
Just thinking about Hala, the film that we were looking at, marriage it's not just divorce that we can talk about when it comes to marriage. There's complex dynamics with Hala's parents' marriage and how they both feel about the arrangement that was their marriage.
The fact that both of them were, both parts. It's not even, the husband wasn't even necessarily too happy. Yeah. So it wasn't like the arranged marriage even just benefited the man. That's not, in many cases that's not even true.
No. He resented it in some way. Actually, before I forget, I also wanted to mention that with Hala herself, a kind of emotional breakdown of hers is triggered by her having a dinner party where she was realizing that she was being set up with her parents' friend's son, kind of for marriage, or like just the beginning of a courting situation. And that was really upsetting for her, and we can talk about if that had to do with the choices she made about her religion and the hijab and stuff. So, she obviously, that really affected her.
What was, I think, really beautiful about that scene is when she runs away and the mom comes and comforts her. And she goes, this is how it went for me in Pakistan. It doesn't have to work this way for you here. So I think that's where we see sort of an example of diaspora communities adapting their understanding of Sharia or law or Islam, practicing Islam. And I will also mention, throughout Islamic history, women have been very outspoken, Muslim women, with regards to marriage. An example is the great-granddaughter of the Prophet, Sukaina. She actually married multiple times, and she was known for writing in her marriage contracts. She was like, I will not be obliged to obey my husband. I mean, we shouldn't exclude these examples either. And she, from my understanding, from tradition, from the stories that were written, she was a poet. She was very outspoken. She didn't wear the hijab. She wasn't, she didn't wear a veil on her head, which is another example. And this is first few centuries that Islam came to life. And back then, we had women who were outspoken, who weren't necessarily following whatever norm that was set up. And this film presents with another sort of example of Hala. Because of this cultural crash that she experiences, being in a diaspora community in America, she isn't necessarily going to follow whatever has been passed down to her. And she can be outspoken, and so can her mother.
And we see that her mother is saying that she doesn't want Hala to follow what is being passed down to her, even through herself. Her mother understands the family structure that Hala has been raised in, and then when she announces that she's divorcing Hala's father, she says that she's doing it, she does it in defense of Hala, which is important because we see that it's not just because she loves Hala, but because she, in particular, does not want Hala to adopt the life that she had. She wants something different for her, which is really, emotionally striking. Yeah.
I shed a tear when that.
Yeah, it was really beautiful. I hadn't dismissed the movie, obviously, because we were there, paying extreme attention and thinking about it, but my attention was really grabbed by that scene and then the following scenes with Hala and her mother, especially because of how Hala's mother in the beginning was introduced as a far less sympathetic character than Hala's father, in that she was portrayed as a authoritarian, the disciplinarian, and she also didn't have an education and blah blah blah. So yeah, I feel like through that moment they were able to recognize each other, and the audience got to recognize Hala's mother.
I think that also speaks to how, let's just be honest, seems like both the husband wasn't entirely happy in the marriage. That's why he had an affair with his colleague, and neither was the mother also entirely happy in the marriage. Rather, it was a byproduct of their culture, and they kind of just were like, okay, well, this is what we do in our culture, so we're gonna do this. But what I think is very amazing about the mother is that she was brave enough to be like, okay, just because this happened to me, I don't want to perpetuate this and let it happen to you. While the father seemed to be a bit more stuck in the whole culture mindset of no, this is how it's done in our culture. I went through it, so why shouldn't you? And I think the filmmaker really shows nuance in these characters, right? These characters are not black and white, but they are also, the father's also dealing with his own demons and his own challenges, and the way that he channels that into the rest of his family is something that the mother saw as that she didn't want to.
But we don't also see the father be apologetic or announce that he's doing something wrong or he's being a bad father or being like sinful or whatever for what he's doing. And like while we know the choices that he's making to have an affair, he's punishing Hala strictly for the way that she does not follow the expectations or rules laid out for her. So that's contradictory.
Okay, that was a great discussion on Sharia and divorce and the movie. Now let's talk about how those themes connect to Montreal today in our lives and Muslims in Montreal.
So, considering a really important theme in our film was wearing of the hijab, the first thing that obviously comes to all of our minds is probably Bill 21. So, like, before we talk about Sharia and all of this in Quebec, I was wondering if, Ilia, if you want to talk a little bit about the state of secularism in Quebec.
Yeah, for sure. From my understanding, Canada considers itself a secular state in that Canada as a whole, it believes in freedom of religion. Quebec, however, inherits a different kind of secularism, perhaps one closer to that of France, in Europe. The idea of laïcité. And laïcité is more so freedom from religion rather than freedom of religion. So whereas in the traditional secularism, one would think we should all be free to express ourselves however we wish or worship however we wish or not worship if we want because we're free of it. So a Catholic man can wear a cross if he wishes, or a Muslim lady could wear a hijab if she wishes, so without being discriminated based off the religion because of freedom of religion. But laïcité is running away from that, so keeping religion out so that we can be free from it and free from its sight before us. And so Quebec, I feel like, inherits that more because, like, reflecting on Bill 21, restricting religious head covering or civil servants in positions of authority not being able to express themselves religiously.
And that's like a weird, they say civil servants in positions of authority. That just means a lot of people in public sector jobs. People
including
think
teachers, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Positions of authority, like heavy air quotes, like we don't really know what that means. But yeah, continue.
Yeah, and the idea is that they're not freedom of expressing themselves, but they should be free from the sort of, I guess, quote unquote, shackles of religion that they're held on to.
And also that non-religious people in Quebec are free from having to be in inherently religious spaces, quote unquote, because people are wearing religious symbols. So yeah, Bill 21 was established 4 years ago.
Yeah, and there's a study done by the Association for Canadian Studies on the impact of Bill 21, and it showed that it has had like a devastating effect on specifically Muslim women in Quebec. 78% of the Muslim women who were surveyed in this research said that their feeling of being accepted as a full-fledged member of Quebec society has worsened since 2019 when it was adopted. Yeah, and 47% of Muslim women said that they've been treated unfairly by a person in a position of authority. Yeah, so Bill 21 is really unfairly targeted Muslim women wearing hijabs.
I think I read that same survey or study saying that Muslim women in particular reported being the most negatively affected of all religious minority groups. When thinking about how Quebec came to Bill 21, I wanted to talk about the proposal in 2005, which caused a lot of upset and discussions about secularism. So the proposal would allow Canadian Muslims to use Sharia tribunals to mediate family disputes. This was unanimously blocked in Quebec at the time and was protested throughout the country. But what not everybody knows about this is that since 1991, Ontario has allowed Catholic and Jewish faith-based tribunals to be used for family law on a voluntary basis, which is exactly what Canadian Muslim leaders were demanding in this case. Really, nobody cared until that was happening, and it caused a lot of outrage. That outrage in particular revolved around a lot of people talking about the way that Muslim women were oppressed in countries that claim that they're ruled by Sharia law.
And I think a lot of this idea of laïcité or what we see playing out in our lives in Quebec, I feel like there's a hint of that in the film. Throughout the film, it feels as though her hijab is portrayed as some sort of symbol that's holding her back from her coming of age and whatever that involves, whether it's, being involved in romantic relationships with boys in her high school or trying to be more outspoken or whatever. That's sort of like the symbol that's holding her back. And it's interesting because at the end of the movie, the last scene of the film is that she's walking away to college with her hair showing, flowing. What I interpreted that as was this idea that she's now sort of free from what was restricting her, what was holding her back, which is what kind of laïcité argues or is about. But I will also say this, that she prayed right before she left the house without a hijab. Mm-hmm. And I think that also ties in with our theme or question of the sort of cultural conflicts when you are in a diaspora community in the West, having practiced some sort of your traditions from home here in the West, where she kept her tradition of praying and worship and prayer, but she's not going to wear the hijab anymore. So it kind of showed that, one, she's kind of free now. She can choose for herself what she wants to do, but that also means that she can adapt and be nuanced with how she practices her religion.
I think we should highlight this with the fact that women who work in government in Montreal don't have this luxury of choosing to wear the hijab or not wear it. It's an extremely personal decision about someone's faith, and I think that it represents how US and Canadian governments have used legislation to target Muslim people.
Mm-hmm. The idea of freedom from religion, but yet the idea of like discussing freedom when Muslim women are actually like not free to express their religion in public, it's just kind of like there's a real dissonance there when we're talking about it. And we just wanted to like build out that timeline, like I was saying, like in 2005, this proposal for quote-unquote Sharia law upset a lot of people and had a lot of Canadians thinking about Sharia. And actually, just a year after, there was a critical event in which, in Quebec, a Sikh student was barred from wearing a kirpan, which is a ceremonial dagger, to school. This student was barred from doing this by a Montreal Education School Board, and the Supreme Court of Canada actually overruled this. Ever since that event, there's been a kind of raging debate about secularism, which is like a tight spiral that has continued until Bill 21. Anyway, a lot of people reference that incident with a Sikh student, but it actually occurred really close to this Sharia proposal, which is why I wanted to connect it.
Yeah, and as mentioned before, like this was also occurring in Ontario. That's when the Sharia debates occurred, and that was based on a law of like Western feminism trying to say, well, we want to protect the Muslim woman, which I think that's also what a lot of, obviously, the government officials who are creating this legislation use to justify it, because Muslim women are oppressed countries that follow Sharia law, and we don't want them to be oppressed. But it's really ironic because it is, and contradictory because it's actually just taking away her freedom to choose whether she wants to wear a hijab.
I don't defend this at all. I personally believe in secularism rather than laïcité. But a person who accepts laïcité would argue, when we keep the civil servants away from showing their religion, then we are, quote unquote, like free from the influence of religion in our lives, keeping us away from being progressive or forward thinking. And so when the thing is like, oh, if there's a teacher who is wearing, a turban or a hijab or portraying their religious sort of tradition, identity, that somehow that's inflicting that religious identity onto the student, and that student is, God forbid, that student is going to become an extremist, or God forbid, that student is going to be stopped from progressing because religion is quote unquote holding them. So that's the idea of laïcité. And that's what Quebec is trying to identify itself as. And I feel like, Quebec is just caught in this identity crisis for the past century. And I think this is just a play on that and trying to separate itself in ideologically from the rest of Canada. But that's what a person arguing in favor of laïcité would argue, that we don't want religion holding people back from progression.
Yeah, that's just the way you said it like that, I think is perfect. It's showing how colonial and how hard it is to hear that, because I think there is also an idea that it's separating religion from society so that you can have a sophisticated intellectual society. But obviously that's a really scary concept when you can't separate religion from society. And obviously with Bill 21 we see how that plays out in really racist ways.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
When you said that Quebec's trying to take away religion from society so that we can progress intellectually. Mm-hmm. But then that implies that religion actually stifles that intellectual pursuit.
Well, it's important to look at history as well. I think I personally believe that religion has led the way to so much growth of knowledge, so much questioning of the world, which leads to so much scientific discovery in any religion. I mean, we're talking, with regards to Islam and Islamic civilizations, the Islamic Golden Age with a plethora of scientists and physicists and philosophers and poets, and how much they gave, and across other religions, like in Judaism we have Maimonides, in Catholicism we have Thomas Aquinas. I mean, there's just so many people throughout religious life that have contributed so much to positive ideas in life, or enlightenment in that way. But speaking of enlightenment, the process of enlightenment, specifically in France, was about separating the church and the state.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of this just goes back to that, because the church at the time had so much control
and was misusing their power, and
yeah.
it was just corrupt, and they took away knowledge from people in order to have control. Which is not to say that we don't see that in our society today either, right? We just think about the economics of our society, right? Like, people in society are just like prey to like the fluctuations of like, oh, recession, inflation, and like all of these, and like we're all just so much in debt, and like consumerism as well is like this new ideology in a sense, right? And all of these things do bind us. So this sense of freeing ourselves from religion, but religion is a set of beliefs, and society will always have a set of beliefs. It'll always have a culture and stuff.
Yeah. The idea of there being like objectivity and subjectivity and being removed from our personal biases or the things that make us unable to make objective judgments, I feel like that idea has always been greatly flawed. It's the idea that some people have subjective perspectives and some people have no perspective. And that's an idea that I can see related to like white supremacy and colonialism like really closely. Because who is secular? Like, who is objective?
What do you mean? Like, because when you say white supremacy and colonialism, the colonialists were all very religious, actually, and that's actually I feel like with regards to Canada's dark history, I mean, it is a prime example of how religion was misused. So I feel like when we say these colonial ideas, the colonialists themselves were religious.
But let's just be very aware that religion is a very, very powerful tool, right? Religion can be used as a tool and a force for good, or a tool and a force for bad, right? And then that's really how you manipulate and how you apply it. So yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say, right? So like when we say like, oh, certain people were very religious and they did this, well, certain people also very religious and they did that, right? So like, how do we comprehend and then assess these things? Well, really, we have to see the motives of those individuals, right? A lot of bad in the world just takes root from greed and power, right? And humans can justify shit any way they want. We're great at justifying, right? Yeah. Language is all about justification. So like, all to say, I guess my point is that like, oh, can you necessarily blame the religion entirely, or is it how people choose to be selective with it and use it? And I think that also talks about what we're seeing over here with Sharia and stuff. We're like, oh yeah, how do people choose to select what they want and take from it, and how their understanding is.
We're talking about how Bill 21 is about secularism. It's also racist. Like, it's a racist bill. It has like impacts that are racist.
Absolutely. So that was a really great discussion. We really took a deep dive, peeled back the layers. But I'd like to hear from all of you guys.
Is Hala battling Islam in this movie? Like, I do think at the end of the movie, Hala is still very in tune with Islam, and she's still a devout Muslim. She's just kind of rebelling against some of the cultural pressures that maybe like an Islamicate kind of, because of like where her parents come from, Pakistan, like maybe women didn't have as many opportunities back there. She's kind of struggling against that, and so I don't think she's struggling with Islam so much as she's struggling with Islamicate.
I agree. I think that her relationship with Islam changes throughout the film and is really moving, but I think in the end, her struggle is with the cultural aspects surrounding Islam.
Yeah, when we're thinking about Sharia and connecting Sharia to this very modern film about a very modern family, and so I think like through what you guys are saying, we can reflect on how the conversations about Sharia don't always allow for the way that, like when people say like Muslim women are oppressed because of Sharia, and then we see Hala, and you can say, why are we talking about Sharia? We're connecting Sharia to the lack of control that she has in her life, But we're not actually really doing that because we're talking about the way that her family structure has been like culturally impacted. Like it's not Sharia, but in fact, like something
culturally impacted by ideologies back home from in Pakistan that they've kind of inherited.
I think Hala specifically is struggling with the traditions that she has had to inherit and her family's inherited from Pakistan, which has been with traditions in Pakistan that are rooted in interpretations of Sharia and the Quran and the Hadiths. I think what's beautiful about this film is that it is all that it is to me is just a journey of faith. Throughout this film, she commits many sins. She eats a non-halal meal. She participates in a sexual relationship with a boy who she isn't married to. She talks back to her father. So there's certain things that she does that clearly are not necessarily religious, law bound with regards to Islam. But she's still fighting through and she's still developing her understanding of Islam. And for anyone who is religious, everyone has a journey with regards to how with their faith. And Hala's, and this is just Hala's journey. And at the end, she still prays, and from my understanding, still holds high regard with regards to Islam and faith. But she isn't going to wear the hijab anymore. So it's just a film that showcases a journey of faith, trying to tackle tradition and what has been you have inherited, and what you're trying to move forward with that inheritance.
Yeah, that's a really great way of wrapping it up. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. Please give us an A. That would be really great if you did that. Mashaal, our queen. Love you.
This podcast was prepared by the fall 2023 cohort of ISLA200 Islamic Civilizations at McGill University.